Today we're going to revisit the RTX 3050 and we're going to see if this is still a viable choice for budget gamers in 2025. Now, we're going to test this card in myriad of live service games with real-world competitive settings. And to make things interesting, we're also going to compare this card against the latest value king, Intel's B580. Our card of choice is the Palit RTX 3050 8GB StormX. It's not the GIMP 6GB card. Here's the specs of our benchmarking rig. And for those who are new to the channel, here's our testing methodology. Okay, let's go. First up is Warzone, and let's see how the RTX 3050 handles Warzone at 1080p with basic settings. Now, at 1080p, the RTX 3050 runs Warzone smoothly, hitting around 100 FPS and action scenes with 1% lows around 87. It's stable enough for competitive play, no noticeable drops. The GPU usage is maxed out on 98%, pulling 105 watts of power. Frame times, as I've said, is smooth, making those shots easier to land. Overall, the RTX 3050 provides a solid 1080p experience and Warzone, good FPS, smooth gameplay, efficient power use. Let's see how it compares later on against the B580. Marvel Rivals is a game which has taken everyone by storm because of its amazing art and interactive gameplay. At 1080p with low settings, the 3050 struggles a bit, staying below 100 FPS most of the time, with drops into 70s during heavy action scenes. The 1% lows dip into the 50s and sometimes can go into the 40s, which makes the gameplay feel a little bit choppy. The GPU is maxed out at 98%, pulling 120 watts of power. It's definitely working hard here. Frame times can get a bit inconsistent, especially during heavy clashes, so it's not as smooth as you'd like. While the RTX 3050 can run Marvel Rivals at 1080p, the experience isn't perfect. Hey, it's playable, but with noticeable dips in performance, especially during intense scenes. Next up is Apex Legends. We are running 1080p resolution here, DX11 with competitive settings. Now, the RTX 3050 delivers solid performance in this game with frame rates ranging between 150 all the way up to 200 FPS. Now this depends on the scene. 1% lows are around 127. The GPU is maxed out at 99%, pulling over 120 watts of power. It's definitely pushing the limits here. Frame times are smooth, which is what you would expect from Apex Legends. Overall, this is a good experience, delivering a smooth competitive experience at 1080p. Now, let's move on to competitive games, which doesn't require a lot of GPU resource. And here we have Fortnite running 1080p at performance mode. And in here, the RTX 3050 is easily hitting frame rates between 380 and 480 FPS, even during our action scenes. 1% lows stay around 185, so it's smooth for fast-paced gameplay. The GPU is running at 96% utilization. It's pulling almost 130 watts of power, and our CPU usage, which is the 9800 X3D, is sitting at 50%, which is probably the highest utilization we've had so far. Frame times are mostly solid, though there are some few random stutters, and this is very common in Fortnite. The RTX 3050 delivers excellently in Fortnite, giving you a smooth, high FPS gameplay. This one will do the job. Next game is Valorant 1080p with competitive settings. Now, even though Valorant isn't super demanding in terms of graphical capability, the 3050 is still pushing an impressive 500 to 600 plus FPS during regular gameplay, making it perfect for high refresh rate monitors. Despite the game being light on graphics, the GPU is running at 98% utilization, 105 watts of power utilized, and the clock speed is pushed to 1920 MHz to keep up with those high frame rates. Our 9800 X3D in here is at 34% utilizations. Frame times are pretty smooth, providing a responsive experience with no noticeable stutter. Overall, the RTX 3050 delivers a fantastic performance in Valorant. Now, let's see how the 3050 handles PUBG at 1080p with competitive settings, DX11 Enhanced API. And in here, the 3050 delivers around 140 FPS while we're going through the landscape. 1% lows do dip to around 100 depending on the scene. GPU utilization is running at 95 to 97%. It is pulling close to 130 watts of power. Frame times are mostly smooth, but you'll notice some spike during intense engagement. VRAM stays under 4 GB, which is good for the setup. PUBG runs pretty well on the 3050 at 1080p. In Delta Force Warfare mode, 1080p competitive settings. Now, what you've noticed in here is that there will be some initial stuttering in-game with the RTX 3050, but things do stabilize after a while, like mid-game. Now, during heavy action scenes like smokes and explosions, your frame rate with RTX 3050 may sit around 90 to 100 FPS with 1% lows dipping into the 60s. Now, the GPU is maxed out at 99%, which is really pushing our frames. Frame times are decent, good enough for hitting shots, but they're still a bit high, between 9 to 10 milliseconds. Our ideal frame times is a stable 8 milliseconds or less. VRAM usage in this game is under 7 gigabytes due to the heavy textures and the large landscape. Delta Force is playable with the 3050, although you would get the occasional stuttering at the start and the slight dip in frame time responsiveness. It's not flawless, but it still provides you a solid, good experience. Arena Breakout Infinite is an extraction shooter which is really GPU demanding. At 1080p competitive settings, performance starts a bit rough with some stuttering when you're engaging enemies, but it does stabilize soon after. Frame rate ranges between 70 to 90 FPS depending on how intense the scenes are, with 1% lows dipping to around 60 and maybe even dropping to 40 on really heavy scenarios. The GPU is definitely maxed out at 99%, drawing over 120 watts of power. Moving on to our PvE games, we have Helldivers 2 and we are running at 1080p native resolutions, low settings. During action scenes, the 3050 manages around 80 FPS with 1% low sitting at around 70. It's playable, but definitely not battery smooth. GPU utilization is 98% and pulling around 150 watts of power. Frame times are solid, but slow at 11 milliseconds. And this is with all determined bugs in a super Helldive difficulty. And Path of Exile 2, the RTX 3050 hits around 70 plus FPS at 1080p during action scenes, with the 1% lows dipping to around 55, making the game feel a little bit sluggish during scenes wherein your screen is just full of monsters. The GPU is maxed out 100%, pulling around 120 watts of power. Frame times are stable, but once again, it's quite slow, sitting at around 13 milliseconds, which is, yeah, that's slow. You can feel the response maybe a bit off on this one. VRAM usage stays under 5 GB. Now, Path of Exile 2 is definitely playable, but the experience isn't the smoothest with the 3050. Now, let's compare the RTX 3050 against Intel's B580. First up is Warzone. Starting with the running benchmark, the 3050 delivers 170 FPS on average, while the Intel B580 comes out ahead with a solid 19% lead. Looking at the 1% lows, the B580 also has a lead over the 3050. That's about 12% difference. Now, there is some similarity when we go into the firing benchmark. The 3050 still is slower compared to the B580. Some difference here and there. It's close enough, right? Close enough, but still double digits. And Marvel Rivals, the 3050 delivers around 78 FPS on average, with lows that's pretty low at 50 FPS. Meanwhile, the Intel B580 is just the superior card here. 38% improvement in overall performance with lows that are probably about 50% better compared to the RTX 3050. Now both cards here are maxed out 98%, 99% on the B580, which is, yeah. Now, frame times on RTX 3050 and the B580 are slow, but they're manageable. Now, there are some micro status on both cards, but this is not that critical. Okay, Apex Legends, and let's start with a heavy action scene here. And RTX 3050 delivers about 157 average FPS with pretty okay low. However, the Intel B580 crushes it with about 60% more frame rates and better lows. Now, both cards are maxed out. However, in saying that, the B580 is definitely more stable here, especially in the heavy action scenes. On static scenes, the lead of the B580 is really clear here. So yeah, that's definitely a night and day difference between both cards. In Fortnite performance mode, the RTX 3050, although it's delivering an impressive 420 FPS with pretty decent lows, the Intel B580 is still the better card here, about 28% more, significantly better lows as well. The RTX 3050 runs at 95 to 97% GPU utilization, while the B580 at 1080p is only utilizing 90% of the GPU. Now, the Intel B580 outperforms the RTX 3050 with 28% higher FPS and also displays better lows. In Valorant, you get pretty high FPS regardless of which card you're picking. However, you definitely would get a much more stable experience with the 3050. Look at those gaps between the average FPS, 1% and 0.1% lows. It's much more tighter than 3050, which is expected with Valorant, depending on the GPU utilization. The B580 does have really high average FPS, but the gap of the lows may affect your precision in game. So in this case, I'd probably pick the 3050. PUBG is a clear landslide for the Intel GPU. You can see that the average FPS and lows just go to the Intel B580. That's what? Around 70% better frame rates. When we go to our heavier mortar scene, this is the same scenario, 200 plus FPS for the B580, while you're only getting about 100 plus FPS on the 3050. In Helldivers 2, the Intel B580 is definitely able to continue its lead here over the RTX 3050. That's about 25% better on our gut lane benchmark. And when we go through the rest of the benchmarks here, it's the same story. The Intel B580 is leading here on the firing and even on the stratagem testing benchmark. However, one game wherein the B580 isn't well polished is Path of Exile 2. In here, the Intel B580 continues to lead. However, the RTX 3050 is very close behind. We're definitely GPU bottleneck here, and the frame rates are pretty tight here. It's pretty close, pretty tight for both cards. Looking at all the differences between both cards, and I know you guys love benchmark chats, even though I'm more into frame time chats. The Intel B580 is about 38% faster on average over the RTX 3050 in terms of average FPS. In terms of the lows, the B580 is about 27% faster over the RTX 3050. And although this comes with a caveat that you are using the fastest Ryzen gaming chip. Overall, the RTX 3050 still holds its ground in 2025, continuing to deliver an okay gaming experience in 1080p. For lighter titles, it's still a good choice, but for far more demanding titles, you can definitely see that it's lagging behind the alternatives. So if you're looking for a balance between performance and power efficiency, the RTX 3050 is something to consider, especially if you can find it on a good deal on the used marketplace. However, the Intel B580 is definitely something that's worth considering. And speaking of which, we've compared it against the RTX 4060 recently. And if you're interested in that, click this video right here, and I'll see you guys over there.